The disaster curse born of humans versus the literal definition of a superhuman within Jujutsu Kaisen. Today we're talking about Mahito versus Toji. All things considered, this matchup is pretty fun to discuss, even though for the most part it's horribly one-sided. Both of these characters are significantly downplayed, and mainly for the ways they lost instead of talking about what they've actually accomplished outside of that. Mahito is on the larger receiving end of this because a lot of people don't take into consideration that he's at an extreme disadvantage when fighting against someone like Yuji because he can't use his curse technique on him due to Sukuna's interference. Toji gets downplayed for losing to Awakened Gojo's Hollow Purple of all people, but regardless, who of these two would come out on top when put up against each other? That's exactly what I'm going to go over here today, and I'm going to start with Mahito since I've talked about Toji at length multiple times now. Before we begin, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more JJK versus battles like this one. Mahito as a curse is truly on a different level than any of the other ones, and in many ways could have been the next Sukuna. All the disaster curses show love for one another. Jogo is pretty distraught when both Hanami and Dagon die, but when Mahito learns Hanami died, he doesn't really care. Couple this fact with Mahito's extreme rate of growth, and the things Sukuna was saying to Gojo start to make more and more sense. Humans flocking together, curses flocking together, comparing themselves to those around them leads to weakness and stunts growth. Mahito isn't one to be restricted by such things. He enjoys fighting and preaches the benefit of enjoying it to Hanami. And when we see Hanami apply these things in his fight with Todo and Yuji, not only does his Jujutsu and curse technique potential expand, he himself gets stronger as a result of unrestricting his soul. Mahito plays with the lives of others and does so for the sole purpose of evolving. Wanting to break Yuji's soul by dragging the corpse of his friend in front of his face and succeeding, he's rewarded with a black flash. Mahito took inspiration from the strongest sorcerer and opened a 0.2 second domain to get the upper hand on a far stronger opponent, that being Sukuna. Take for example the opposite situation happening to Jogo, who was too scared to open his domain, scared he would lose in a clash. Mahito powers through and is rewarded for it with yet another black flash, broadening his understanding of his curse technique once again and letting him reach his final form, or the true essence of his soul. This is all stacked on top of the fact that Mahito has an extremely overpowered curse technique. His ability to maintain the shape of his soul makes the normal "I'm going to hit him really hard" tactics virtually useless against him. Just like he says to Todo, it doesn't matter how strong your attack is, using Black Flash has no effect if you can't hit my soul. There are ways to counter this ability, and we'll get into that in a second, but where Mahito's curse technique really shines is his ability to transfigure other souls with the touch of his palm and the extended application of this technique when he activates his domain expansion. In chapter 22 and 23, we get pretty good details on Mahito's curse technique during his fight with Nanami. The soul or the body, which do you think came first? Does the soul dwell in the body, or is the body built on the soul? Nanami answers wrongly here, saying the former, but Mahito corrects him, saying the soul should always exist before the body. The shape of the body will always be dependent on the shape of the soul. I'm not healing, instead I'm reinforcing the shape of my soul. My curse technique can touch and reshape the soul. So where normal curses would have to heal their body when an arm is broken off or suffering a giant injury, Mahito doesn't spend curse energy healing. He instead makes his body conform to the shape of his soul so it never takes any real damage. Hence what I said earlier when he says to Todo, "If you don't hit my soul, there is no effect." There are some other interpretations in the series about how souls work, mainly Kenjaku, who disagrees with Mahito, saying the soul comes before the body and says instead that the soul is the body, which I largely disagree with, mainly just because Mahito should be far more of an expert on this stuff considering his curse technique and experimentation he's done thus far, on top of the soul being visualized to us numerous times in the manga and it looking nothing like anyone's body we've seen. On the flip side of that particular argument though, we do see both Yuji and Sukuna's souls, and Yuji's looks like him and Sukuna's for some reason looks like Yuji's. They seem like weird outliers for this though, or rather exceptions to the rule rather than debunking it. Beyond this though, Mahito can still transfigure the shape of his soul, but doing so may result in more damage being done to that specific part of his soul if he's fighting someone strong, so he doesn't normally opt to do it against someone around his level like Yuji. The things he can turn his body into are pretty strong at certain points. He can grow horse legs to move faster, he can amplify his fists with whatever this is and hit harder, and he can even make sharp weapons out of his own hands. On top of this though, Mahito normally keeps a stockpile of transfigured humans on him to use in combat. Fair to say that those would be standard equipment for him. With these, he can make random goon monsters to fight for him, or even use his arm like an automatic weapon and fire little transfigured people at you. Now, even with Mahito having this extremely overpowered curse technique, there are still counters to it, but we'll start first with Yuji Itadori, since he is Mahito's self-proclaimed natural enemy. Yuji is a vessel for Sukuna, and we saw in chapter 11 that Yuji and Sukuna's souls can interact with each other inside of Sukuna's innate domain, or in other words, Yuji can perceive the soul. Mahito attributes this to the fact that Yuji simply has the necessary requirements to see the soul, having another soul dwelling within his body. This same reason is why Yuji can fight Mahito without worrying about his curse technique. Because of Sukuna being within Yuji's body, if Mahito tries to transfigure Yuji's soul, he's by proxy transfiguring Sukuna's soul, which Sukuna doesn't like, so he'll harm or unalive Mahito if it happens. This same sentiment you can extend to all of the reincarnated players in the Culling games. They were turned into cursed objects and put into a vessel that they had control over, so they naturally have these other souls dwelling in their body and should thus be able to harm Mahito's soul if they fought him. But by this time, Mahito is already long gone anyway. Another counter to this is domain expansion or simple domain. Mechamaru uses a simple domain in order to damage Mahito's soul during their fight, and when being given the explanation by Kenjaku, we learned that domain expansion would have the same effect, which makes sense considering domain expansion is just way better than simple domain. You can also counter Mahito by just being strong. He mentioned that he can't one-shot Nanami, and we see that. And then we also know that some souls are just resistant to his curse technique naturally. Like he says against Yuji and Todo, the souls with weak rejection come together to form one body, which obviously implies that there are souls with stronger rejection. Adding to this, Mahito wonders if he can end Todo in one touch in the state he's in after being weakened by Nobara and a black flash from Yuji. For the last thing to talk about, we have to consider Mahito's domain expansion, although this won't be too relevant for reasons I'll state later pertaining to Toji. But Mahito's domain is real simple anyway. He just expands his curse technique so he doesn't have to lay a hand on you in order to transfigure your soul. So all in all, there are a few ways to counter Mahito's technique. 1. Be strong, or at least have a strong soul. 2. Being able to both perceive and hit the soul. 3. Not getting caught in his domain expansion. And 4. Simple domain or your own domain expansion. Luckily for Toji, he falls into the categories of 1, 2, and 3. So let's go through them one at a time. 1. Be strong or at least have a strong soul. Toji falls into this category for very obvious reasons. He's obviously very strong, far stronger than Yuji and Shibuya or Todo, and his body literally beats souls, and doesn't even need a soul to operate. In Shibuya, when summoned by the Seance Granny, Toji describes that his body beat her grandson's soul. This is important because Granny mentions that she didn't summon any of Toji's soul information and that she only summoned the physical information, but Toji's body is special. Given the fact Toji's body can operate and function without his soul, I'd say his body being built on the soul like Mahito thinks is just simply wrong, and transfiguring his soul won't result in Mahito transfiguring his body. And that's if he could even get it off. On top of Toji being faster, which I'll get into in a minute, there are a couple of other factors to consider when going over the scenario. One is Toji's curse resistance. 244 chapters into the story and we still haven't been given an exact description on this, but there are hints sprinkled throughout the series. In chapter 144, Yuki mentions how Maki survived Jogo's fire attack not because of her curse resistance, but rather her own physical toughness. This at the very least implies that curse resistance could lessen the damage or impact of cursed techniques or cursed energy. In chapter 77, Yuki says despite not having cursed energy, Toji Zenin was able to sense curses using his 5 senses. By eliminating all cursed energy, his body became sharpened to the point where he developed a resistance to curses. He was truly superhuman. This one implies the same thing really, that Toji can resist curses because of his sharpened body. This is to the extent that Toji can actually swallow a curse and no bad come of it. He can just spit it back up whenever he wants. In chapter 151, during Naoya and Maki's fight, it stated that Maki can now see through projection sorcery because of the body she gained, which allows her to properly counter the technique. The last example of this I want to mention comes from Shibuya, where as soon as Toji recognizes Megumi, he immediately regains control of his body and unalives himself. The narrator dialogue that follows is cut from the anime, but it says, "A heavenly gifted body strong enough to overwrite the soul." For him, even this out of control curse technique wasn't. Wasn't meaning it wasn't out of control, by the way. I know some people I talked to were confused about that since it seems like the sentence just stops. But there are some of the ways of Toji's curse resistance. I'll go over another major one in its own section. That's another way Toji is probably resistant to Mahito's transfigurations. The last way only applies to Toji and Shibuya, and that's simply that Toji has no soul to transfigure. The soul in his body is the grandson's, but the body is Toji's. So I think all of this more than justifies Toji either being strong or having a strong soul. So moving on to number 2, being able to both perceive and hit the soul. This one is far more simple to explain than number 1. Maki's blade is a replica of the one Toji wielded first, the soul split katana. It ignores the hardness of everything and cuts the soul directly. But in order to use it at its full potential, the wielder must have a pair of eyes that can see the souls of inanimate objects. We see Toji use this thing to cut through Geto's toughest curse like nothing. Maki uses it to one-shot Naoya like nothing, and even someone without the ability to see curses like Daido could use it to do some damage. Number 3 is similarly easy to justify and ties back into Toji's curse resistance I was talking about, where Toji can literally choose to ignore entering a domain expansion if he wants to, and even if he does enter, the barrier can't recognize him because he has no cursed energy. So Mahito's sure hit won't work on Toji. See, most people try to be dishonest in front of this statement and say things like that was only Naoya's barrier and blah blah blah. But the thing about this is Mahito's barrier is used as the example for ignoring buildings in this context, so it should obviously apply to him as well in all other domains with the exception of Sukuna's. Aside from this though, it seems when Maki or Toji decide to enter a domain, they can do so wherever they want, as Mahito stabs Naoya in the back while still spawning in the domain. That wouldn't normally be a big deal, but when you wield a sword that negates durability, I think it becomes a big deal. Maki already landed a hit before even being fully in the domain. So with this massive disadvantage Mahito is at, is there a stat difference that could potentially allow him to fight with Toji and pull out a W? The answer is a simple no. While Mahito is a strong disaster curse, his best speed feats even prior to his nerf come from his fight with Yuji, where Yuji is consistently able to keep up with his speed and combat Mahito. Some people might try and argue Mahito holds back on Yuji, but as you can see from him saying he's going to imbue a strike with his maximum of cursed energy, that's probably not the case. And while it is true that Mahito can certainly grow stronger during a battle, that won't really make a difference if the battle is too short for him to grow from. Even when Mahito does grow in battle, it's rarely ever his speed or attack power that goes up, and is normally an expansion on his curse technique. Yuji just after Shibuya was getting stronger and better control over his curse energy, not to mention he hit a black flash on Mahito to end their fight, pushing him even further. Yuji then goes on to be weaker than Maki in the fight against Sukuna, and is said to be so by Sukuna. I mean, even if you want to say they're equals, it doesn't get better because of Toji's soul splitting sword and resistances to Mahito's curse technique. I think now it's about time I brought up ISB Mahito or True Form Mahito, because a lot of people think this makes a difference when it comes to this fight, but I'm here to tell you that it most certainly does not make a difference here. In volume 15, there's an extra attached to the end of chapter 132, which is the chapter directly following Mahito's defeat, that describes his new form in detail. Mahito's unbridled soul, 200% tougher than his original form, according to his own estimates. A binding vow further increases his toughness in exchange for halting his metamorphosis. As you can see from this statement, Mahito gets much more durable, but in terms of being faster or stronger, nothing really implies he gets that sort of amp to his abilities. He performs the same against Yuji, although he has extra appendages to help with that, but Yuji also only comments on Mahito's durability and how he's tougher than before. It even reminds him of his fight with Choso, then saying his attacks just don't reach him, which is clearly in reference to the fact they do no harm since we see the attacks landing. Now, in all fairness to Mahito, this was very effective against Yuji, since it's even stated at the bottom of the page here that if Itadori hadn't nailed him with Black Flash, Mahito would have torn him to shreds. But I'm sure why a durability boost wouldn't matter when talking about a guy who negates durability with the sword is extremely obvious. As far as if Toji does enter Mahito's domain, regardless of his resistances to the technique, Mahito does get an amp inside of his domain due to the environment, but sadly this difference isn't enough to cover the massive difference between their stats. I really don't even think it would get to this point, to be honest though. Toji isn't the one to kind of just play around. I imagine he'd try to end Mahito quickly, then move on to being a bum and not taking care of his children. All in all though, losing this fight isn't bad for Mahito. Toji is a really bad matchup against a lot of curse techniques because of his resistances, and I didn't even go over his precognition or anything that would throw the fight even further in his favor, so Toji wins.